Hello everybody, my name is Jennifer Maker. Today I'm showing you how to use epoxy resin safely on the Great Maker Show and Tell. Epoxy resin is popular for tumblers because it creates a beautiful glass-like coating that protects everything within it, like your paint, glitter, and decals. But it's important to handle epoxy safely to avoid exposure and potential allergic reactions. About a year ago, I made some awesome glitter tumblers, coated them with epoxy resin, and showed you how to do it in a detailed step-by-step tutorial and video that has become one of my most popular videos. But I didn't go into a lot of depth on safety in that video. So with epoxy resin's rise in popularity in the last year, I want to go into more depth on epoxy safety because you can use epoxy for your tumbler safely if you follow just a few important steps. First, it's really important to read and follow the safety data sheet, also called SDS, that comes with your epoxy resin. Always know what safety measures any manufacturer recommends for its products, whether it's for epoxy, paint, glitter, sealer, glue, or really anything else that you craft with. You can find safety data sheets in the product box, but if they're missing, just go online and search for the product name plus safety data sheet. I have the safety data sheet for the epoxy resin that I like to use, linked over on my blog and in this video. The safety data sheet for the product that I use these days, which is the Alumilite Amazing Clear Cast, says that epoxy causes severe skin irritation and eye damage. It's harmful if swallowed. Avoid contact with the skin, eyes, and clothing. Wear protective gloves and protective spectacles. Wash hands well after handling, and avoid discharge into the environment. So let's really talk about what that means. So epoxy resin comes in two bottles, an A side bottle and a B side bottle. It's two parts, right? The A side is the actual epoxy resin, and the B side is the curing agent. Epoxy in its liquid uncured state is mostly classed as an irritant to the eyes and skin, which is what you'll see in the safety data sheets. It's the mixing and curing process that we need to be most careful with, because that's when the epoxy is most harmful to us. And to get to that pretty glass-like coating on our tumblers, we have to measure out an equal portion of both A side and B side and mix them together carefully ourselves. But once it's fully cured, epoxy is considered safe for household use, not necessarily safe for putting food into, just so that's clear, but it's generally considered safe and it's classified as a non-hazardous material. Okay, so how do you mix and cure epoxy on your tumblers safely? Here are the three important things to remember. Number one, wear proper protective equipment. Number two, work in a ventilated area. And number three, keep your craft area clean. Let's talk about each of these epoxy safety precautions in more detail. First, wear proper protective equipment for epoxy safety with your tumblers. When I work with epoxy, I protect myself from touching or inhaling epoxy by wearing proper protective equipment, which some people just call PPE. That means gloves, a respirator, and an apron over a long sleeve shirt. All right, let's talk about the gloves first. Wear gloves every time you mix, brush, pour, clean, or clean epoxy. Basically, every time there's a possibility your skin can come into contact with uncured epoxy. Repeated skin exposure to epoxy can lead some people to develop a permanent allergy to it. I recommend and wear nitrile gloves because they offer better resistance to epoxy and solvents. Nitrile gloves are inexpensive, easy to come by, they come in lots of different sizes for a good fit, and they come in cute colors. Do not use latex gloves as they're too porous and can swell when they come in contact with solvents. If you are all sensitive to or allergic to nitrile, you can get PVC or neoprene gloves instead. This is important. If you do get epoxy on your skin, wash it immediately with regular soap and water twice. Do not wipe it away with alcohol, acetone, or any solvent because this can cause your skin to absorb the epoxy easier, which we do not want. Respirator. All right, So wear a respirator with organic vapor filter cartridges every time you are near uncured epoxy. The fumes are hazardous to us, our children, and our pets. A respirator with organic vapor cartridges, that's the magenta ones right here, will protect you. I recommend a full face respirator because of the dangers of irritating your eyes too, but if you don't have a full face one, you can use a half face one with goggles. But if you are all sensitive or allergic to epoxy, you want a good fitting full face respirator that forms a tight seal. Also, the organic cartridges begin working as soon as you expose them to air. So to keep your cartridges working as long as possible, store your respirator in an airtight container between uses. The organic vapor cartridges must be replaced every 6 months at minimum. If you ever can smell epoxy with the respirator, it's time to change those cartridges. Aprons. Spills and drips happen, and if you get epoxy on your clothing, it's easy for it to come into contact with your skin. It's also pretty much impossible to get epoxy out of clothing. So I wear a PVC apron when I am working with epoxy, and I also have long sleeves to avoid skin contact with the epoxy. And if you already know that you're sensitive or allergic to epoxy, or just want maximum exposure protection, consider wearing a Tyvek suit. Plenty of people do. I have links to all of the things that I've discussed for the proper protective equipment in the description for this video, as well as over on my blog at jennifermaker.com. I actually link to the exact things that I am wearing in this video. Now, it's also really important to work in a ventilated area to avoid exposure to fumes. Epoxy fumes generated while mixing and curing are toxic, and you must work in a well-ventilated area for your safety. Fumes are produced for the entire time the tumblers are curing, so that could be like 72 hours. If possible, work outside in the fresh air. And if that's not possible, like for me, because I live in Michigan, where it's not very good weather most of the time, you need to take some extra steps. The worst thing that you can do is work in a closed room with poor ventilation. And that pretty much describes most people's classrooms, now doesn't it? So at minimum, you're going to want to open a window and turn on a strong fan to vent the fumes outside. If necessary, buy a fan and position it so it draws air away from you. Now note that if you're working outside, you need to be aware that the temperature must be at least 70 degrees Fahrenheit for mixing and pouring epoxy, and ideally 75 to 85 degrees for curing epoxy. If it's any colder, your epoxy just won't cure. Now, if you already know that you're sensitive or allergic to epoxy, or you just want maximum exposure protection, you can buy or make an epoxy fume booth. So you can make one inexpensively using an indoor grow tent that's large enough to stand in. So like at the minimum, that would be like 4 by 4 by 72 inches tall. You'll also want an inline duct fan that's strong enough to properly exchange the air in your grow tent at least once every minute. So use a fan that's at least 110 CFM if you have a 4 by 4 tent, and an intake vent to supply fresh air. The exhaust vent needs a dryer type vent hose to reach a window or a door or wherever your outside is located, right? You can use a window unit mounting kit to seal the window around the vent, or simply cut a piece of insulation foam to fit the window opening and run the fan and vent out of it. It's important that the fumes are actively removed from your tent. You cannot just use the tent, or all you're doing is trapping the fumes in there with you. Be sure to wear your proper protective equipment whenever you enter or use or are in your epoxy tent, as the fumes will be much more concentrated in such a small space. And by the way, if you get a tent and you're just not sure what the right fan to get is, I have a link to a fan CFM calculator, which will help you determine the strength that your inline duct fan needs to be. And that is linked also in the description for this video. Now, because we work with things like epoxy and spray paint often, we created our own inexpensive fume booth, which we use for both epoxy and spray paint fumes. And we used a 4 by 8 grow tent, an inline duct fan, and dryer vent. So This is what it looks like, and it works really, really well for us because we can work without worrying about the smell, which of course this can be, difficult. Everyone's a little bit more sensitive to that. And it's indoors, right? So the temperature is correct for curing the epoxy or curing, like things that have been spray painted also need to dry in a proper temperature. And it's got a great fan and it vents to the outside. So this is our setup. And if you want to make something like this, it doesn't have to be quite this large, but this worked really well for spray painting as well because you need a little bit more space when you're spray painting. Now, I like to use wet to dry sandpaper to wet sand my epoxy tumblers because I feel it's safer and it doesn't put a lot of epoxy dust in the air that can then be inhaled. So if you also do wet sanding, make sure you keep the area that you work in well ventilated, wear your gloves and respirator, and wash any exposed skin carefully after sanding. All right, let's talk about keeping your area clean for your safety. It's important that you protect your work surface from epoxy spills and drips. It's a good idea to use disposable plastic sheet over any surface that you need to protect. And tape like electrical tape can be used to keep the plastic in place. Electrical tape is also really great for protecting your tumbler rims and bottoms or anything else that you don't want to get epoxy on. I also will put tape on my tumbler turner gears so that they don't get like a little drips of epoxy on there. I also recommend disposable cups and popsicle sticks for mixing and paper towels for wiping things up, as this will mean you can dispose of all of them right away. I do not recommend that you reuse anything when you're working with epoxy. And it also helps to keep your work area clean and uncluttered, as this avoids accidents or just things bumping into each other and transferring epoxy from one spot to another. You'll also want to have 91% isopropyl alcohol on hand for wiping up the rims of tumblers and any spills that you have. Some people also use acetone, but I often don't use it because it's so strong and it's typically not necessary. Alcohol works great. Just don't use either alcohol or acetone on your skin if you get epoxy on it. Remember, just soap and water. And it's equally important to pay attention to your epoxy cleanup process. Keep a trash can or bag near you as you work so you can put these items in there immediately and then remove it right away from your work area when you're done. It's important to note that containers of uncured epoxy resin should not just be thrown away. They can create heat, they generate heat as they cure, and that could lead to a fire hazard in a small enclosed place like a trash bag. If you have a bit of epoxy left over from making tumblers, allow it to cure right next to your tumblers as they cure, and then dispose of it. So a lot of people wonder if epoxy resin is food safe. Honestly, that was the first question that I had when I considered making tumblers with epoxy on them. And I think it's really important to talk about epoxy and food safety. If you're making tumblers, you need to be sure that the epoxy resin that you're using is at least listed as FDA food safe on its packaging after it's cured. Now, after it's cured, epoxy should become an inert plastic and it should be fine. Many of us currently have lots of epoxied items around our house, often without even realizing it. But there's a lot of different epoxies out there and they're not all considered food safe. Always check the information that comes from the manufacturer to ensure that it's safe to use on something like tumblers. Now, but it's really important that food safe does not mean that you could put epoxy like inside a tumbler or on the outside of a plate or bowl or any kind of container of food or drink. The food safe information only applies to the outside of a container of food or drink. So the outside of a tumbler, not to the inside. It's a very important distinction. Now, I use Illumilite Amazing Clear Coating and Casting Resin, which claims to be food safe after it's properly cured and only when it's applied to the outside of a food or drink container. But really, it's just so important to stress that food safe does not mean it's okay to ever eat or drink directly from an epoxied surface. That's one of the reasons that why when I make tumblers, I usually stop my resin about 3/4 of an inch or even an inch from the rim of the tumbler, because this means the resin never touches the drinker's lips. So like when I take a drink from it, my lips are touching the aluminum, not the epoxy. I just feel like this is better. We don't know everything about everything, and since there's clearly some issues here, I'm not going to take a chance with my safety or my family's safety. And they still look amazing, even having the epoxy stop before we get to the rim. On the other hand, if your tumbler comes with a straw and your lip isn't ever going to touch the rim, then it's fine to bring your epoxy up to the rim. Just don't go over the top of the rim and into the tumbler. Now, I'm sure you're wondering, are there any alternatives to epoxy if you want to make tumblers? So yes, there totally are some alternatives to epoxy. I currently know of several alternatives that you can use if you're sensitive, allergic, or cautious but still want to make tumblers. The alternatives that I have heard about but not yet tried are Crystalac, which is a water-based polyurethane, Clear Diamond Finish, which is a clear urethane, and 2K Clear Glamour Clear Coat, which is a spray urethane. I haven't tried them myself, so I can't comment on their effectiveness, safety, or look and feel. I simply know that some tumbler makers prefer to use these over epoxy, and I myself plan to experiment with them in the future. I will let you know how things go. So please be sure you subscribe to my channel so that you know when I talk about epoxy and epoxy alternatives. And of course, all the awesome tumblers that I'll be making in the very near future. If you have any questions at all about making tumblers using epoxy, please leave your question below or come and ask over in our awesome Cricut group where we love to make tumblers too at jennifermaker.com/cricketcrafters. This is also the perfect place to share photos of your epoxy tumblers and also photos of yourself in your proper protective equipment. I love seeing people be safe. I cannot wait to see what awesome things you make. And that's it for today. Remember, if you can tell me what you want to make, I can show you how to make it. Until next time, this is Jennifer Maker reminding you to craft a life you love.